I almost didn't get here today. In fact, I almost fell victim. I did. I was bumped off 2 planes on the way here because of the superstorm. And I think for me, at least, as a foreigner in these parts, and perhaps to many Americans too, the storm was really a reminder of how, to what extent, so many of the great cities of the United States are still really maritime cities. And of course, although we no longer live in the age of steamships and transatlantic migration, there are many, I think, patterns of American history, at least East Coast history, the history of the great ports, of migrations, of religious production and exchange from the United States across the Atlantic that I think really mirror what I'm going to talk about today with regard to Bombay and the Indian Ocean world. And perhaps we can maybe even turn to that in the questions, the extent or the ways in which I think the history of Bombay and the Indian Ocean are comparable to the history of New York and the Atlantic. The reason I give this preamble is because in talking about Bombay and in talking about South Asia more generally, I try to conceive what I'm doing in, let's say, a larger world historical context. And I try to make a case, at least I hope, to a mixed audience that some of the things that I talk about today will be recognizable as larger world historical processes. But in short, what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to be talking for about 50 minutes, so I'll try not to try your patience for too long. I'm going to be talking about the real question of what happened to Islam in the long 19th century. The long 19th century then, sort of, kind of 1800s through around 1920. 1915 is when my book finishes. What was the nature of Muslim modernity in that period? Really was the long 19th century the period of not only the emergence but the dominance of Islamic reformism, of Islamic modernism? Or is there a place for a different story, a different set of processes in that period? Of course, also one of the things I'm doing with the book, and it's there in the subtitle, Religious Economy, is trying to put forward, I think, a sort of a new, at least with regard to the study of Islam, a new methodology of how do we study religious history. I also, as someone who works on South Asia, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, as well as the Middle East, I'm also here trying to find a way in which we can connect the history of Muslims in South Asia to the history of Muslims and indeed of Islam in the Middle East as well. And I'll be turning to the case study of Iran in relation to Bombay as part of this. So, to begin proper then, there's a couple of things I need to define then, first of all, as we move on. The key terms then of the title, really, Bombay and Islam, and how the two come together. After all, Bombay isn't usually regarded as being a Muslim centre. Well, Bombay, of course, we can see here the great early 20th century entrance to Bombay, the gateway to India. And the first thing I'd like to suggest to you is that we see Bombay not so much as an Indian city, not conceive it within a national or even regional framework, but conceive Bombay as being a global city, as being a gateway to India, not only for British imperialists, but also for the large number of Muslim settlers who move in and out of Bombay in the 19th century. It's the centre, as I'll argue then, of an oceanic marketplace of a religious economy centering on Bombay. So I'm putting forward the idea then of Bombay as being a Muslim city, and I also want to talk briefly about how we can kind of conceive Bombay in relation to the contours of 19th century Islam. Well, Bombay in many ways is the great cosmopolitan centre of the West Indian Ocean, and indeed in many cases the entire Indian Ocean in the 19th century. Bombay is a great centre of trade and employment. It's an industrial city, in many cases, in many respects, the first industrial city in Asia and the most industrialized Muslim city in the world in this period. It's a great centre of trade and employment then. It's a great centre of transportation, indeed of new industrial forms of transportation. Bombay sees the first steamship to Asia, the first steamship to cross the Indian Ocean, reaching Bombay as early as 1825. This is only really literally a couple of years after we have the first steamship crossing of the Atlantic from South Carolina. It's the centre of the first railway service in the whole of Asia and indeed in the Middle East as well. This is tremendously important, as we'll see, in terms of the kind of story of connectivity that I want to tell today. Bombay is also, partly through these industrialized travel networks, a great centre of exile and diaspora. The many Muslim diasporas that move there from different parts of the Middle East as well as Africa and indeed Southeast Asia. And in fact, the first Japanese convert to Islam converts in Bombay in the 1890s. So it's a great centre of Muslim mixing of different Muslims, of Muslim cosmopolitanism of different kinds. Bombay is also reflecting its role as an industrial centre, as a centre of transport, communication technologies. It also becomes a very key centre for printing, photography and telegraphy. I think it's important to bear in mind here that printing doesn't really start anywhere in the Muslim world until around 1820, 1817, 1818. It doesn't really take off until the 1850s. And Bombay really becomes a huge exporter, as we'll see, of printed Muslim materials in a whole range of languages for an export market, as well as it were as a domestic market. Well, that's something then of why I think Bombay is important generally as this great oceanic cosmopolitan centre. But it's also important, as I've said, as a Muslim centre. Of course, that's somewhat unknown. We don't familiarly think of Bombay as being a Muslim centre in comparison, let's say, to many North Indian cities or many North Indian religious institutions like the great Madrasa Deoband that emerges in the latter part of the 19th century. And Bombay always seems to play not even second, but maybe third or fourth or fifth fiddle to cities such as comparable cities, Cairo or Istanbul, in this period. But I'd argue, as we'll see, that Bombay becomes in many ways a comparably significant, in some respects more significant, I think more cutting edge or of the moment city than Istanbul or even Cairo, which don't crucially have their industrialized Muslim populations there. The total Muslim population of Bombay is pretty significant. In 1850 it's as large as 100,000, in 1901 it's risen to 160,000, in 1915 when I finish off the book it's risen to as much as 180,000. This absolutely dwarfs the population of the only really significant industrialized zone at Zanguldak in the Ottoman Empire in this period. It has a much larger population. And crucially, as we'll see, what is happening here is the creation of not only an industrial city, but an industrialized Muslim workforce. It's also a highly diverse Muslim population that emerges there. This population comes from both Bombay's oceanic hinterland, as to say, across the ocean. We have Iranians coming partly as merchants, sometimes as political or religious refugees, sometimes as just hangers-on. We have a large number of Iranian beggars and fakirs in the city in the 19th century. Many Muslims come from East Africa, particularly associated with the steamship business. They come as laskars, as particularly East African, black African workers in the steamships, and particularly in the lowest levels of the steamships, loading the fuel there. So there's again that industrial proletarian element that is drawing in workers from Africa as well as from within India. And as well as these African, Iranian, indeed Arab, Yemeni and other Middle Eastern Muslims in Bombay, there's a large population brought in from Bombay's continental hinterland, that's to say within India itself. And these are also a very diverse bunch. There are Konkanis from the Konkan coast who speak their own language, mill workers and dock workers who move to the city in large numbers. We have Muslims from the Deccan speaking Dakhani who flee to Bombay in particular because of the very significant famines that struck Hyderabad state in the middle of the 19th century, as well as, of course, a large number of Gujarati, in particular Ismaili Muslims that reach the city. So we have the emergence then of this Muslim cosmopolis. Now what happens there? Well, of course, the familiar kind of story in the historiography of the scholarship of Islam in the 19th century, we would expect that kind of Muslim cosmopolis to produce the familiar, as it were, modernized products of Islam in the 19th century, pan-Islamism perhaps, or in the Indian case, Muslim nationalism. And certainly that is part of the story. Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, of course, the putative founder of pan-Islamism, has his great discovery, his great moment of discovery, indeed prints his first books in India, in Bombay, in the 1850s. The other great pan-Islamist movement of the early 20th century, the Khilafat movement, the attempt to save the Ottoman Caliphate, Bombay plays a large role in that story as well. Similarly, with regard to Muslim nationalism, the founder of the Muslim League, the head of the Muslim League, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, lives in Bombay for a very long time and practices there as a lawyer. And similarly with regard to other forms of nationalist politics, that again, kind of that modernist kind of notion of political or religious political action, the Indian National Congress is founded in Bombay in 1885. So certainly these kind of reformist or recognizably modern religious political forms of organization play a part in Bombay's story. But there's a much larger picture of religious activity and religious production that Bombay has a role in, and indeed Bombay that much more characterizes Bombay, and that's what I want to focus on. So in the book I draw on a wide range of sources in Arabic, Persian, Urdu, as well as English, which is becoming a global language of Islam in Bombay as well as other places in this period. And the picture that comes out of these abundant sources, abundant because so many of them are produced and printed in Bombay. We're talking about newspapers, other forms of print, but new forms of hagiography, even journalistic forms of hagiography, stories about saints, large number of travelogues, particularly Persian travelogues from Iran, as well as etiquette books, books concerned with how Muslims should behave during the great festivals, the great proletarian festivals, in fact, of the city in the 19th century. But what emerges from this picture is not so much the dominance of modernist or reformist Islams, even though, as I say, they were there in Bombay, but of what I prefer to call customary Islam, forms of Islam characterized by hierarchical relationships with saints or with holy men of one form or another, whether imams, as in the case of the Aga Khan, the Ismaili imam, who lives in Bombay in the 19th century. It's the center of Ismailism in the later 19th century, or whether in forms of Sufi holy men and their brotherhoods, or other forms of what I call, as it were, enchanted, rather than Weberian, the familiar modernist, disenchanted religiosity of the period. So there seems to be a paradox then, and that's what I want to explore, and that's what I use this model of religious economy to explore. There seems to be a paradox that the most modern, or as I prefer, the most industrialized city of indeed anywhere where there are Muslims in the 19th, early 20th century, seems to produce what the scholarship would normally characterize as the least modern of Islams, what I call customary Islams. As I said, all of these phenomena regarding saints, Sufis, imams, and other charismatic figures. Well, how is this the case? Well, this is where I'd like to turn to the methodology I develop in the book, a methodology of religious economy. And I think that's, I would like to think at least that's the more significant element of the book. And that's why I'll spend perhaps 5 minutes or so talking about this model of a religious economy, because I think it's a transferable model, a transferable sort of analytical tool or methodology we can use for other areas as well. So my claim really is that 19th century Bombay creates a pluralizing, competitive, and highly productive religious economy in which enchanted productions, these holy men, miracles, forms of pleasure, carnival activity, festivals, are the most successful, and they successfully outcompete reformist or modernist Islams in this particular oceanic wide religious economy. Well, why do I develop this model of religious economy here? Well, I think we need some kind of analytical model, and I felt this dealing with the large amount of data, the large number of different Muslims, the sheer cosmopolitan nature of Bombay. We need a methodology that can cope with a picture of not only multiple sources and multiple actors, but of course the complex interactions which go between them. Now, of course, the majority of the scholarship on this period, and indeed particularly with regard to South Asia, frames the emergence of modernist or reformist Islams within, as it were, a kind of a dichotomized model of tradition and reform. Now, much of the scholarship here has been dealt with, as it were, there's a kind of a dialogue going on between the two, a kind of a critique going on between the two. There's a sort of a two-way conversation, a dialogue between reformists or modernists and the traditionalists. But I think that's really highly problematic, because the more and more scholarship, the more and more case studies we've had on different religious movements from the 19th century, often they don't fit into either camp. The great Deoband madrasa, the Deobandis that emerged in the 19th century, of course, the classic case in point, often seen as the axiomatic reformist movement, but so many of their activities are still centered around charismatic sheikhs, peers, Sufi types of relationships, Sufi practices. So really they're neither one thing nor the other. And the same with many of the so-called traditional organizations, take on many, as it were, reformist or modernist or new types of either organization or activity or even doctrine. So that kind of dichotomy doesn't work, nor does it actually fit the levels of what I see as being exchange between the two. That's to say, kind of the borrowing between many types of religious organization, or as I prefer, firm, the kind of the cross-fertilization of ideas and practices and forms of organization. So the model of dichotomy and dialogue doesn't work. We have a much more kind of complex series of interfusion between the two. The other problem, of course, with this model of tradition and reform is that non-reform is rendered static. Modernist or reformist Islam seem to be where history happens. They seem to be the guys who are changing and doing new things. And of course, the problem is with that it actually renders tradition as being static. It's in a sense falling for the rhetoric of the reformists themselves. That the tradition is just old-fashioned, they're going nowhere, they're doing nothing. But again, when we look more closely at what I prefer to call customary organizations, this isn't really the case. The third problem, I think, is that we have often, particularly within the South Asian context, the notion of, or the language, which I think fails analytically, of speaking of Muslims as a community. And of course that, again, is to fall for some of the rhetoric of the period, particularly the rhetoric of within the Indian context of Muslim nationalism. I think the notion of Muslims as a community doesn't really explain, I think, the sheer diversity and the sheer, in fact, the new types of Muslimness and being Muslim, and new types of Muslim, and the multiplicity of communities that come about in this period. So moving towards from critique of the scholarship towards solution, what I started looking for then, what I realized I needed to understand Bombay in this oceanic marketplace, was an analytical model which was holistic enough to take into consideration multiple interactions between many different religious organizations, or as I will call them, religious firms and entrepreneurs and consumers in this period. A model then not of dialogue between reformists and traditionalists, but as it were a model of a multilogue, of many people speaking chaotically at the same time. That's the situation we have, but how do we make sense of that? I also wanted to find a model in which we could put all of the actors, all of the participants on an equal footing, rather than say, well, the modernists, the reformists, they have the spirit of the age. These are the people who are changing, doing things, acting historically. The traditionalists, they're just kind of stuck in the past, they're going nowhere. There's that kind of rhetoric, as I say there, within this language. So I wanted to put all of the actors on an equal footing. Also considering that the influence of Weberian sociology has been extremely important in the study of modernist and reformist Islam, the idea that there is, as it were, a modernizing, disenchanting trajectory away from charismatic forms of religiosity towards, in the words of some scholars, a Protestant, disenchanted form of Islam. There seems to be that kind of an inbuilt teleology there in the Weberian form of sociology. It's been adopted, I think, consciously or otherwise, by a whole range of scholarship. So I wanted then to create a model that was capable of mapping alternative outcomes. The reformists don't need necessarily to win, as they seem inevitably to do in that kind of Weberian model. So I wanted, again, something that could map multiple outcomes, maybe multiple outcomes in different parts of the world, or according, as a historian, to different contexts, different situations. And I also wanted to create a model that could encompass transnational and oceanic movements, then to create kind of a way of studying Islam, of doing Islamic studies, that I think kind of fits in with the study of Islam globally, and indeed with global and world history, as speaking as a historian. So this is when I turned towards the model of religious economy. Now, I make no claims for having invented the creation of religious economy. It's really the work of the sociologist Rodney Stark. And I think it's important to recognize, I really want to stress that when I speak of religious economy, this is a model of sociology and historical sociology. It's a product of sociological, not economic thought. So this isn't, as it were, a neo-Marxism that is trying to reduce religion down to material or economic forces. Even though material and economic forces can play a role in this model, the model is capable of dealing with ideas as well as material transactions as well. So according to Rodney Stark's simple, as it were, Webster's dictionary length definition, religious economies are like commercial economies in that they consist of a market of current and potential customers, a set of firms seeking to serve that market, and the religious product lines offered by the various firms. Now the key word here is like. As I say, it's a mode of analysis of using an economic model to understand the complex social transactions that give birth, give life to religion as something that is created, lives, fails, dies, gets passed on in social life, in social history. So the word like there is important. It's not reducing Islam or reducing any other religion to economy, but it's using the interpretive language and the interpretive models of economy to do this sociological, indeed religious work. Well, of course, on the one hand, it can seem really very reductive, and I think it's a bit of a shock. I mean, I must say, when I wrote the book, I was somewhat hesitant to really push through all the way through the language of firms, of entrepreneurs, of production, of consumption. And I have to confess, it was only really when I came to the proof stage that I thought, well, I've got to bite the bullet and just, kind of do this for better or worse. And I corrected all of the words organization for firm and so on, really at the last minute. So now I've done that, I might as well stick to my guns now as well. So what is this analytical vocabulary doing for us? Well, the analytic vocabulary we have then is the notion of a firm and an entrepreneur on the production side. And I think that's important because I'm trying to give here social life to religion, to move away from the idea that religion is something that just gets handed down. That's, as it were, religion from the inside, or maybe religion from the language of theology, or maybe from an older historiography of seeing religion through tradition. I want to see how new people can create new forms of Islam, can actually control and create, master, produce new forms of religiosity. And they do that as firms. And the language of a firm there then seems to me to make more sense rather than just talking about more loosely about an organization. I think what's also crucial then is about the model of a religious economy, is looking at the social relations, the interplay between firms and entrepreneurs and the market and consumers. So we're not just talking about believers, we're talking about consumers, and seeing how religions are produced, religious forms, religious ideas, products and services, I'll come to in a moment. These are produced and they either succeed or they fail according to their relationship with a consumption base. Of course, typically, religious history is written in the way that someone founded a religion, or someone wrote a book, they published a book, or they had this great idea. But we never actually kind of follow it through to the consumption side. Did that fail or succeed? How did it catch on? What made it attractive to a certain group of believers, qua consumers? So I think the model of religious economy is really helpful because it helps to explain religious change, religious history, through this kind of interplay between producers and consumers, not only looking at one side, as it were, of the bill. Talking of the language of production then, what do I mean by religious production? Well, here I'm putting into this analytical category books, ideas, rituals, in some cases actual commodities, talismans that of course have a market value as well. And of course also I'm crucially talking about religious services, because insofar as religions have economies, insofar as the religious economy, there are religious economies, they are often in large part service economies. So we're talking about services such as healing, services such as social networking, indeed the provision of jobs as well, services as the provision of miracles, charismatic intercession, that will see a crucially important in success in at least this particular marketplace. And also forms of religiosity, sociability, entertainment, the carnivals that we'll see as being so important in Bombay in the 19th and 20th century. So, of course, now if I've tried to talk up the model of religious economy, I also want to kind of make a clear statement of what it cannot do. Of course, religious economy, the model, the analytic of religious economy, isn't capable of assessing the truth claims of religion. It doesn't do that. I hope it leaves them intact and untouched. So when one's working with the model of religious economy, one is not either promoting or de-promoting any religious truth claim. That's the job of theology or the job of phenomenology. So the religious economy cannot do that, for better or worse. It's just not what it's doing. Nor, as I've said, is the model of religious economy, just to re-emphasize that point, it's not reducing religion to solely financial exchanges. It's not a materialist form of analysis. It's not a neo-Marxism, even though, as I say, and as we'll see, it can take on board financial transactions as well. But what I think it does crucially do then is map complex interactions between all participants in a religious environment, particularly complex urban, cosmopolitan, oceanic environment. And indeed, of course, it remodels that environment, that place, as a marketplace. And I think what it crucially does by bringing together the production and the consumption side of religion, I think it socializes religion. It's a product then of sociological thought and historical sociology. It's trying to give life to religion. Religions, new religious forms are created and they fail or succeed according to their success in the market. It's a generative and transactive rather than the static form of religious analysis then. Okay, well, having done that, I'd like to move on now to what I hope is going to be well, certainly the less theoretical, perhaps the more interesting, and certainly the more visual interesting side of the story, as I move towards the actual study of Bombay and the Indian Ocean, and putting into practice then this model of religious economy for this particular environment. And of course, one needs to realize that there are all kinds of religious economies. The model of religious economy was originally developed to understand the complexities of religion in the United States. The United States, which of course has a free market for religiosity. It's a similarity, I think, perhaps historically with connections, in some senses. I think the common colonial connections of the United States and India help us to explain some of that, as it were, that liberal religious economy that we find both in India in this period and we find in the United States. But of course there are not all religious economies are liberal. We have illiberal or monopolistic religious economies. Safavid Iran, the Iran in the 16th and 19th century, in which Shiite Islam is enforced as a state religion and other forms of Islam are persecuted and expelled. That would be, as it were, a monopolistic religious economy. So we have different kinds of religious economy. The one I'm talking about today then is an industrialized, highly productive, liberal, and indeed, and a competitive religious economy. But there are other forms as well that we can map onto different environments. And of course, I think it's also important to recognize, again, within a sort of a global analysis in which we're partly looking at here, and I know which the centre is interested in, that different forms of economy, different types of religious economy interact. And we see that happening here, or we will do as I move on, in the case of the liberal and productive religious economy of India and of Bombay, interacting with the much more closed and monopolistic religious economy of Iran in the 19th and early 20th century. Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty and let's look at some pictures as I move on. Well, of course, as a historian, it's all very well for me to come in with a theory, but as a historian, I want to sort of historicize it to see, well, how does this come about? How does this type of religious economy that I've described come about in Bombay? How does that happen? It doesn't just spring out of nowhere. And of course, while I'm trying to do something different as a global historian rather than a colonial historian, I'm trying to look at Bombay in a larger context than solely the colonial context. Of course, I'm not going to miss out or downplay the role of colonial actors in this phenomena here. The most important then, in terms of the religious economy of Bombay, the most important colonial actors are what I call the missionary catalysts. We have a large number from the early 19th century, right from the 1810s and 20s, as soon as Bombay's religious economy starts to be, as it were, or indeed India's religious economy starts to be liberalized. What this allows in is not only through various colonial laws, what allows in is not only, as it were, the free movement and the free conversion of different religious groups within India itself. Of course, this is often socially disruptive. I'm not saying this is always a good thing. It's often, it often causes a great deal of problems in many parts of India. But it also means that foreign Christian religious firms, as I term them, are allowed to enter the Indian, particularly the Bombay marketplace in the 19th century, particularly from 1813 onwards. So we have these new foreign firms then, particularly missionaries that come not only from Britain, but also interestingly from the United States. Baptist missionaries from the US are among the earliest missionary firms to enter Bombay. So again, we're moving beyond solely a colonial model into an oceanic and indeed a world historical framework here. And my claim of what these missionaries do is they act, as we can see here, as catalysts. They act as catalysts within the marketplace. How is that? Well, because they bring along new forms of religious technology in the more general anthropological sense. They introduce new forms of religious organization. The idea, indeed, of being a missionary, of being a mission. The very word mission, as a mission, comes into Urdu at this period. And not just the word, the whole, as it were, social technology of organization as a mission. So the missions create, as it were, a new form of religious organization and religious productivity and dissemination. They reach out to the poor in a way that at least elite Muslims in India had never done, preaching among these proletarians, particularly the new proletariat of Bombay. They reach out to a largely, as it were, unserviced part of the marketplace. Another very crucial technology they introduce is vernacular printing. Within Bombay, as indeed throughout the Middle East, and the larger Muslim world at large, including Southeast Asia, Christian missionary organizations are really pioneers in printing in Arabic, in Urdu, in Malay, in Persian, in all of the languages of Islam. And they're really ahead of the game. They're doing that before there are any, and with much larger numbers, before there are any, as it were, Muslim printers at all. So they act as catalysts in this way. Also through new methods of fundraising. These new missionary organizations are voluntary associations. They're kind of classic in the literature of modernity. They're classic voluntary associations that bring in donations and organize their finances very effectively. So altogether, their impact is not that they convert so many people. In fact, they don't. But through the schools, through their vernacular printing presses, through their fundraising, and through their attacks in public, here in English, but also in many vernacular publications, they publicly attack Islam and they publicly attack Hinduism and Zoroastrianism and other religions in Bombay, indeed Judaism as well in this period. They act then as a catalyst that stirs things up in the marketplace. What comes out of that? Well, by 1835 we have the crucial colonial development, which the Metcalfe Press Act and a series of other press acts, which liberalized the economy of print. Of course, by the early 20th century, by certainly the 1910s and 1920s, this has changed. I'm not trying to rewrite colonial history. Certainly the new series of press acts in the 1910s and 20s in the period of the freedom movement within India restricts the press a lot more. but we're not dealing in my book in that period. We're dealing with a period when there was a much more liberalized economy of print, when Indians were allowed to own printing presses and to print, at least in particularly print religious text freely. Of course, that's part of colonial legitimacy, that the sphere of religion, the colonial government didn't touch that. So this mixture of a liberal access to printing technologies, these were cheap printing, mass-produced iron printing presses available in Bombay. The mixture of that with the fact that religion was largely, at least officially, untouched and unpoliced, at least non-political forms of religiosity were unpoliced. This helps to create an environment when there's much more religious productivity. And we'll see that then how these particular forms of technology, whether the technology of organization of the mission or the technology of vernacular printing, starts to spread. Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, some of the figures that we do find adopting this technology are our usual suspects, as it were, the modernists of the period. As I've said, we do find Islamic modernist movements in Bombay. The family of Badruddin Taibji is one of the great examples. The Taibji family and the organization they found, the Anjuman-e-Islam, the Islamic Association, is relatively important in Bombay. Certainly it's always been regarded as the most important reformist association in Bombay, because Deobandi-Islam never actually really expands in Bombay. The Anjuman, the organization, or the firm, as I see it, is founded in 1876, and by 1893 they've raised enough revenue, again through borrowing those kind of voluntary association forms of charitable gifts and organizing their finances, borrowing that model from the missionaries. They've managed to found this large high school. They're teaching, if you like, a pretty familiar form of modernist, reformist, indeed Protestant Islam, in which access to the Bible, access to the Quran, and indeed reading the Quran itself, is considered very important. And of course that's a borrowing again from those Protestant missionary firms as well, the importance of access to the printed, translated vernacular scripture. But what's their outreach? Well, their outreach is relatively little. The service they're providing is largely, on the one hand, educational, and it's providing a literate and modern education to that very small number of Bombay Muslims who will be able to enter the colonial administrative service. And of course also the school itself. As their main point of outreach, the school only has about 600 pupils at any one time. When one's talking about an Indian Muslim population, or indeed a Muslim population in Bombay of 120, 160,000, to have 600 students isn't very much. And of course also we might even see, when looking at the economic side of it, the building of this lavish Indo-Saracenic building, although it's in the real estate, as it were, of their religious firm, of this Anjuman firm, is right in the finest district of Bombay. We might even question whether that was a successful strategy for this firm. Their outreach and their effect then in the larger demographic of that 160,000 Muslims in Bombay is very, very limited. Who then is more successful? Well, it's here I want to turn back again to that idea of print and what happens then with this economy of print. Again, I'm reacting here to I think a larger kind of standard narrative now of Islam in the 19th century, of religious modernity and indeed of the emergence of Protestant Islams, and that's linkage to print. The very significant work of Elizabeth Eisenstein with regard to the linkage between printing and the rise of Protestant Islam in Europe, and the way in which scholars, particularly a scholar who I respect a great deal, one of my mentors in fact, Francis Robinson, his work on of taking that Eisensteinian model to create a Protestant trajectory for Islam in the 19th century in India as well, in which printing allows access to scripture, and as it were, there's a sort of an inbuilt teleology, an inbuilt process to that. If scripture can be printed, people get their scripture, there will be a Protestantizing, reformist effect on religious change. But of course, when I looked at this large number of texts from Bombay, either translations of the Quran were very small in number, and they were certainly very small in number relative to what I would call these more enchanted texts. Many of them illustrated, such as this one, The Adventures of Hatim Tai. Many of them, in fact, hagiographical texts, advertising, as I'd say, miracles within the marketplace. And again, this isn't tradition. This is new stuff. To language this in the language of tradition would be to miss the point. Types of text we have here, the main text is in Urdu, but the cover here is in mixed English and Urdu, as one can see. this is a new type of text. It's really a form of journalistic hagiography. What it's actually telling here is a really fascinating story of the actual kind of competition of religions within the marketplace, the competition of morals, in fact, in the Bombay marketplace. It's a story of a building, the Sitaram building, owned by a Hindu and a Parsi entrepreneur, in the centre of what's traditionally been Bindi Bazaar, a Muslim marketplace, and indeed largely is in this period. Opposite the Sitaram building is the shrine of Pedro Shah. It's called Pedro because, again, it's that older cosmopolitan echo. He's supposed to have been a converted Portuguese from 200 years ago. But what happens in the Sitaram building is that the lower floor of the building is let out to a Scotsman, and he sets up a bar there called the Windsor Bar. Every night we have this endless stream of boozy British and other European soldiers who come streaming out of the bar and upset, of course, the moral order of the community there. People complain to the saint, said Pedro Shah, and one night in 1903, I believe the exact date is on there somewhere, one night in 1903, the entire Sitaram building, one of the first skyscrapers in Bombay, at least in relative terms, collapses all of a sudden. This is reported in all the newspapers. This did indeed really happen. But responding to the reports in the newspapers is this new type of journalistic hagiography that makes a case for this being the response of the saint. The saint and the saintly agency, those miraculous powers, are even stronger than the no less invisible powers of capitalism that have put up this big building. So it's a really kind of dramatic, visible event, the interruption of saintly agency within the Bombay's physical landscape. And what's important with texts like this, and there are many of these hagiographical texts around, these stories of saints and miracles, they're a large part of the printed marketplace of Bombay Islam, is of course they serve as advertisements for the saints and their shrines. They play a role within the religious economy. They're saying, look, if this saint is even capable of knocking down a tower block, for sure he can help you out if your child is ill, or if you're in need of a job, or if you're short of money this week. So there's this way in which the entire modern industrial fabric, the capitalist fabric of the city, is being incorporated into this economy, this printed economy of enchantment. We find other types of religious firm operating in the marketplace then. If I've talked about the foreign firms, the missionaries, and if I've talked about the Anjuman or the reformist firms like the Anjuman Islam, there are many shrine firms as well. And these are ultimately then the more successful in this particular marketplace. In many cases, because they've been there for as long as the city has existed, they've been there since the 17th and 18th century, some of these shrines are really own the prime real estate within the city, such as the shrine of Haji Ali there off the coast of Bombay. So their physical location is actually, kind of very important part in itself of their success in the marketplace. They've simply been around there longer. They've simply been there longer than the, as it were, the newcomers into the market, such as the reformists. What do these offer here? Well, these kind of firms offer, on the one hand, miraculous maritime services. Many of the hagiographies talk about saving merchant ships at sea, saving the Muslim merchants who are doing a great deal of trade with East Africa, with Iran, with other regions, saving their goods during storms at sea, or saving Muslim passengers, Muslims making the Hajj. Bombay becomes the great Hajj terminal of the 19th century, the kind of Dubai of its day, saving them from storms at sea. So there's a kind of, in terms of looking at the services being offered by this religious firm, one of them is supernatural insurance. And of course, some of the hagiographies, some of the texts that advertise these services indeed name the price, because there is a financial transaction involved as well. Other forms of service that are offered by these types of shrine are entertainment as well. The great industrial fairgrounds, the kind of fair rides, steam-powered fair rides, merry-go-round, Ferris wheels, that actually happen during the annual Urs, the annual saintly birthday festivals of these shrines, that attract up to 100,000 pilgrims at a time at these shrines. So these are great, as it were, proletarian playgrounds as well. And again, it's important that we're talking here about an urban proletariat that is a wage-earning proletariat. It's a new social phenomenon in Muslim history. They might be poor, but unlike peasants, they have a bit of money left over at the end of the week or by the holiday, which they can invest in, well, obviously in their families, but also in their religious life, and indeed in the shrines that offer services that are attractive to them and their families, whether saving the sick, whether helping them, as we'll see, get employment in some cases, or whether providing entertainment. Once again, this isn't tradition that is somehow divorced from the capitalist, the modernity of the period. Some of these shrines are really located right in, as it were, the capitalist or the modern infrastructure of the city itself. This shrine we can see here of Bismillah Shah is located in there, in the great Victoria Terminus Railway building, the great, as it were, museum, or the Taj Mahal in some senses, to industrial modernity in Bombay in this period. The shrine is actually located, it's actually part of the building built within its stone as well. And of course there's a story about that too. And what's happening here? Well, because, again, the religious services being offered are appealing to the market and the consumers. Many of the hagiographies associated with the saint in this period show up the tensions that people felt in this period of travelling on trains. They were suddenly lost in the middle of India among people that they had no rishtadari, they had no relations with. Train travel was a great source of tension in this period. But if you pass by the shrine of Bismillah Shah beforehand, gone the wrong way, make a small offering, then you'll be protected in your journey. And the hagiographies, again, offer us evidence, offer us proof of this. Other types of shrine firm that emerge in Bombay in this period are what I call the franchise shrines. I've talked about East Africans who moved to Bombay. This is a cosmopolitan religious environment, religious marketplace. Tried and tested religious firms, tried and tested shrine firms from other regions set up franchises in the city. Gujaratis in particular, I've talked about a large number of Gujaratis who migrate to Bombay. They will go to the franchise shrine of Baba Gaur, a shrine, the master shrine where the saint is buried is there in Bombay. But a religious entrepreneur comes and sets up this franchise of the shrine there. We have other shrines like this in the dockyard areas of Bombay that still survive to this day, which were marketed not as franchises marketed to Gujarati migrants, but marketed to East African migrants, particularly East African ship workers, steamship workers, who were there in the dockyards. And they again marketed, their services they had were possession, healing services through possession and trance. And also again entertainment. Still to this day in the dockyards there, one finds what I've actually described elsewhere as being a kind of Muslim voodoo. Possession, music, forms of intoxication, the expulsion of spirits. That's very much, if you like, kind of a voodoo Islam in the sense of a creolized Islam. Not the voodoo of, as it were, of the Atlantic, but a parallel voodoo of African traditions mixing with Muslim traditions here in an Indian oceanic context. And again, these are services provided by entrepreneurs. Of course, in terms of the largest turnouts, we have the great Bombay Muharram processions. And we have to bear in mind that Muharram in this period was the great proletarian festival. There were efforts by the colonial state to control it, of course, and efforts by the same token working together with the colonial state in many cases of Muslim reformists to control these festivals. Because although there were Muslim festivals, Muharram festivals, which Sunnis and Shias would celebrate alike, there were times of great intoxication, of drinking bhang, a cannabis preparation, or drinking arak, a form of alcohol. So these are times that these are real proletarian days off. A day off from the factory, people make the most of it. So these are, again, great carnivals within which various religious firms, particularly the shrine firms, participate. Moving down the scale, though, this is an economy, a religious economy, as I've said, that's very complex and productive and works on a whole number of levels. We're not talking about then just these large, successful firms. We're also talking about single individual entrepreneurs, the begging babas, the fakirs or holy men. Of course, there are very large numbers of these fakirs, of these beggars. Of course, we've got I put up a sign that's contemporary, but that really kind of reflects, and I think wonderful Indian English reflects the same critiques of the reformists in the 19th century. This isn't Islam, these are just scamsters. These are just charlatans, a word that actually gets borrowed from English into Persian and into Urdu as well, I believe, in this period. But of course, from their own side, the religious logic of themselves, the entrepreneurial babas and their consumers, the people whom they serviced, was that these people were faqirs, following the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, al-faqr fakhri, poverty is my pride. They claimed that their poverty gave them special powers to bless a wedding, a circumcision, a birth, a funeral, or, if the donation wasn't given, the power to curse it. So we can see there is a financial element, there's a transactional element, and we have very large numbers of these figures. The sources from the time say they turn up to every wedding, circumcision, birth, etc. And they're, again, the smallest players in this religious economy. We also have then different forms of religious organization, not just shrines, but in some cases brotherhood firms. From the more conventional scholarship, of course, which call them the Sufi brotherhoods or the Sufi orders. They too are active in Bombay, because not in a religious economy in which custom has a great deal of kudos, custom has a great deal of credit, as it were. The Sufi brotherhoods, with their claims to go back for centuries, are enormously successful too. They form what I call brotherhood firms. Again, this isn't just the handing down of tradition. This is new forms of religious productivity and new forms of religious distribution as well. Remember that the ships and the trains are as important as the printing presses for the distribution of these religious products and services and for the advertisement of the religious firms themselves. This particular figure, Habib Ali Shah, a migrant from Hyderabad, from the older religious centre, sets himself up in the dockyards. Indeed, in the P&O, the Peninsula Oriental, the greatest dockyard in India and maybe even in Asia in this period. He sets himself up there right next to his house. He doesn't have a shrine, he's buried there, but it's really the centre of his brotherhood rather than a shrine. He sets himself up right next to Dockyard Road railway station. From there, his biography, the hagiography surrounding him, describe him sending out his followers, sending out his, as it were, his missionaries, copying again the religious firms, introduced the foreign religious firms. His hagiography describes him sending out these figures along the railroad into other parts of India and indeed through steamship, as we'll see in a moment, to South Africa as well. What's interesting about this figure then is even his doctrines then seem to match the environment there and match the new technologies of the day. The most important doctrine that he preaches, or one of the two most important doctrines, is that of tasawwur sheikh, of a picturing the sheikh, of making a mental picture of the sheikh himself. When you're in trouble on that train in the middle of India, think of me, think of the sheikh, and then he'll come to miraculously help you. And there are many stories of this. But how does that happen? How, if you're in, as it were, a religious firm which is expanding into South Africa, expanding across India, not everyone clearly can meet this person. How can they picture him? How can this doctrine work without the use of, or as it were, the enchantment of technology, without the use of the new technology of photography? So these photographs, these devotional photographs of Habib Ali Shah are distributed among followers. That form of distribution helps his religious services, tasawwur sheikh, picturing the sheikh for miraculous rescue, it helps them to work. The other major doctrine that's outlined in his writings, he writes a good deal of Persian text there in the dockyards, are that he himself is the barzakh, he himself is the, as it were, the interface between the two worlds, and that through tawassul, through intercession, he can mediate between the divine realms and the human realms. He can channel the divine energy that, of course, is manifested in his miraculous services. So it's an Islam of hierarchy and intercession that really fits in with the social relations of not only Indian Islam more generally, but of this highly stratified capitalist environment. He's preaching to the dock workers. Indeed, that intercession, he seems even to work among another of his services, which is to provide jobs for the dock workers around him. Some of his chief sheikhs, his chief deputies, his khalifs are themselves jobbers, middlemen who find people jobs in the dockyards. So that kind of, as it were, it's a theology of as above, so below. In that same kind of picture of hierarchy and intercession that works in the divine realms as well as in the nitty-gritty of day-to-day life and finding a job in the dockyards. We also have Iranian diasporas in Bombay. Large numbers of Iranians come there. And indeed, Parsis are there in Bombay, Zoroastrians, and Baha'is. It's a little-known fact, but the Baha'i religion that conventionally seen as emerging out of Iran in the 19th century is, in textual terms at least, a product of Bombay. The first Baha'i works of scripture, the Kitab-i-Yaqeen of 1882 and the Kitab-i Mubin of 1890, are both printed and distributed from Bombay. So Baha'i religious firms are also operating out of Bombay. They're operating out of Bombay because there are a large number of Iranian exiled printers there. They settle in Bombay because they're exporting to a much more closed religious economy, a monopolistic religious economy of Iran in the 19th century. Shiism is still the dominant state religion. It's only actually through the efforts of Bombay Zoroastrians that the jizya, the poll tax on non-Muslims, on Zoroastrians, is lifted in 1882. But nonetheless in Iran, the Qajar dynasty upholds a censorship system. It borrows it, the very word, censor, adopted into Persian in this period. So Iranian printers, political exiles, religious entrepreneurs, of course, are very active in Bombay as well. One of them is a certain Iranian Sufi called Safi Ali Shah. He makes his name in Bombay. He moves to Bombay. He writes a travelogue of his time in Bombay. He prints his first book, Zubdat al-Asrar, The Quintessence of Secrets, in Bombay. It's reprinted there. It's distributed across the ocean. He makes a name for himself through Bombay's religious marketplace and indeed through the technologies available there. When he goes back to Iran, he becomes the most successful the successful Iranian Sufi in the 19th century. What we can see here then is the interaction of different types of religious economy. The more productive and liberal religious economy of Bombay having an impact, a transformative impact, on the religious economy of Iran as Sufi starts to grow in much large number and become an important part, again for the first time in 3 centuries, of the Iranian religious landscape or the religious economy. This happens not only with Safi Ali Shah, but also with another very notable Iranian exile, the most famous of all Iranian exiles in Bombay in this period, the Aga Khan I, of course the Imam of Ismaili Muslims, and his son, and in my own terms his impresario, a term I borrow from the distinguished historian of religion, whose name has just disappeared from my head, Peter Brown. So he acts also his impresario. What I conceive as happening here with the Ismailis in the 19th century, or the Aga Khanis in the 19th century, is a family business in exile. The Aga Khan moves from Iran to Bombay, and there in that place really kind of reinvents his public persona, writes his own biography of himself, a very religious text, and his son reaches out to all of these shrines across India that, partly through the intervention of a British colonial high court ruling in 1886, are declared to be Ismaili shrines, and therefore owing their tithes, owing financial remunerations to the Aga Khan himself. So we have then Ismaili Islam as a classic product, I would argue, of the Bombay religious economy, that again reaches out to East Africa, reaches out to Iran. The Aga Khan sends out his own missionaries back to the old country, back to Iran, and again helps pluralize the religious economy of Iran as well as East Africa, before the Aga Khan III moves out of Bombay to Europe in the early 20th century. What we have here then is a great success story, maybe the greatest success story at a global level at least. Ismailism, of course, is one of the most visible global Islams of the 21st century. We have a religious entrepreneur, the Aga Khan I, arrives in Iran. By the time of his death in 1881, he's been transferred into a figure at the heart of the religious establishment of Bombay's religious economy, building this very grand shrine, a classic, as it were, outpost of the customary or the enchanted Islam of Bombay's religious economy. This Aga Khan shrine there is in Bombay till this day. Well, finally, just as the last little example I want to give, is if I've talked about the outreach in one direction across the West Indian Ocean towards Iran, in making the claims of the reach and the productivity of Bombay Islam, I also chose the other case study, the far end of the West Indian Ocean in South Africa. We talked a few moments ago about Habib Ali Shah, the Sufi and his brotherhood in the dockyards of Bombay, and how he sent out his missionaries in different directions, sent out distributing his religious products and services inland into India, but also into South Africa. A Bombay Muslim, Ghulam Muhammad, a former migrant to the city from the Konkan coastline, is dispatched by his master, then Habib Ali Shah, to Durban. He finds great success in Durban, again, so much so that this reproduction of Bombay Islam, this shrine there, is produced in Durban. It's still there to this day, where I spent some time doing field work with the descendants and family of Ghulam Muhammad. And in the early 20th century, we have, again, the role of print and the role of advertisement there, that the reproduction, the export and then reproduction of Bombay's religious economy there in South Africa is done again through the crucial role of the enchantment of technology, through the role of print, and particularly a text here which of course does a wonderful job for me in calling itself an ishtihad, in calling itself an advertisement, or if you like, an announcement, but in my terms an advertisement for the festival of the saint itself. So the same shrine festivals, the same customary festivals, the same pilgrimages based upon miraculous intercession, miraculous services, and indeed of entertainment as well for the indentured Indian labor force in South Africa are recreated there across the Indian Ocean. Well, very, very briefly, what I hope I've shown then is that the model of religious economy is capable of allowing us to map complex interactions that really characterize Islam in the 19th and 20th century. Interactions between many different groups of Muslims, between many different types of Islam, and indeed the production and the success and failure of different forms of Islamic productivity, and indeed different Islamic product services and the entrepreneurs and firms that create them. I hope I've also shown that there's this crucial role, though, in consumption, in appealing to a marketplace. Within the context of Bombay, then, what was crucial was not that modernist Islam's, reformist Islam somehow caught the current of the age, that was somehow more modern than the others. Within a context, within a marketplace dominated by a much larger demographic of uneducated, working class, proletarian Muslims from various different regions for whom custom still held an appeal, that custom had proven success in getting things done. Religion got things done. It healed the sick. It got you jobs. It got you entertainment. When customary religious firms, products and services had that long track record, they still held great appeal to the larger proletarian demographic of Bombay in the 19th century. In the long 19th century, then, I claimed that in the larger picture, that this isn't a century in which either global Islams, uniform Islams, being described by certain theorists and scholars, nor indeed reformist Islams had the bigger picture. In this most modern, which is to say the most industrial Muslim city in the world in this period, we still see the thriving of a religious economy of enchantment. Thank you very much.